We're continuing in our short series on the problem of power. Remember last week we talked about how there's a difference between power and authority. A few years back, about 30 years back, when I was working as an intern at Bethany Presbyterian Church in South Sacramento, I lived in Northeast Sacramento. And California is famous for its complex freeway system, and Sacramento is no different. And I had to go down Highway 50 and turn onto 99 to go south. And right at that intersection is also Interstate 80. And it's a mess of off-ramps and on-ramps, and you got to have a PhD just to figure out which exit to take. And I was going to an evening meeting, and at about 5 o'clock in the evening, I was going on the flyway that went from 50 to 99. And about right here on that flyway, somebody must have dropped a box of nails, because I got a flat tire. And so I stopped about right here on the flyway and thought, well, I'll just get out of the way so that people can get by me. So I pulled over. Only problem is, after about 3 cars, a gigantic semi-truck came, and he couldn't get by me. So I thought, well, maybe I better get out and change my tire. So I turned on the radio real loud so I could at least listen to some music, because it was about 147 degrees out. And I started changing my tire. And after about 5 minutes, I heard an announcement during the traffic report on the radio. They said there's somebody with a flat tire on the flyway between 50 and 99, and they're blocking traffic all over the interstates. So I got up and I looked, and sure enough, the flyway was backed up, and Highway 50 coming from Lake Tahoe was backed up for as far as you could see. And then I turned around, and because Highway 50 was backed up, Highway 80 was backed up as far as you could see. And because 80 and 50 were backed up, 99 was backed up that way all the way down, and 99 was backed up all that way as far as you could see. And I thought, I'm responsible for all of this. Children are crying because their fathers haven't come home. Lovers are missing their evening dates. Business meetings are failing to happen, and it's all because of me. Now that's power. Remember that Friedrich Nietzsche said that the will to power is the driving force behind all of life. And he also, last week we learned that Max Weber defined power as the prerogative to determine what happens and the coercive force to make others yield to your wishes, even against their will. There is a coercive nature to power. Power is forceful by its nature. Power is not given, power is taken, whether by physical means or by psychological means. And in this world, the ones who have the most money have the most power. We in America are a powerful nation, not just because of our military, but because of the financial resources that we have. Because of our financial resources, we can do a lot of things. We can purchase a lot of things that give us power. We have automobiles. They give us the power to go from place to place and the power to do things that many people in other parts of the world absolutely cannot do. We have the power of the telephone. And it's not just a telephone nowadays that we carry around in our pocket. It's an amazing communication device. This last week, I downloaded DirecTV Now. If you haven't heard of DirecTV Now, it's an entire cable package that goes directly to your telephone, and no matter where you are in the world, as long as you have a cell phone reception, you can watch your favorite TV show. Now that's power. A business also uses its financial resources to use power in both positive and negative ways in society. Power then becomes a game. George Soros is one of the richest men in the world. He's worth over $25 billion, and he recently said, money doesn't matter, power does. Well, what are the effects of power on our relationships? One of the major effects on our relationships of power is that power destroys the possibility for love. You got a little preview of that. Got a new clicker this week, just still trying to figure it out. Paul says love is not self-seeking. But when we seek power, we cease to have the opportunity and the ability and the possibility for love. There was a sociological study done on power in relationships, and they discovered that there is an inverse relationship to power and love. They called it the principle of least interest, and they discovered that the one who loves the least has the most power. The one in the relationship who loves the least wields the most power. Now, this is pretty obvious if you think about it. If the friend that you have is not nearly as interested in being your friend as you are in theirs, you'll do whatever they want to do. And so they have the most power in the relationship. How does this work in other relationships? Well, in marriage, withholding love enhances your power. Back in the 70s, when the feminists started getting up and going, the feminists decided that they needed to push back. They needed to be more assertive. They needed to use power in their relationships. The problem is that the answer to 50 million pushy, obnoxious men is not 50 million pushy, obnoxious women. It works in friendships as well. I just told you, if you have a friend that you love more than loves you, they're going to be the one who wields the power. They'll decide what you do and where you go and when you meet. Same thing with dating. The one who shows the most interest in a dating relationship has the least power. And the absolute last thing you want to do when you're dating someone is to tell them that you love them. You become completely powerless at that point. They also discovered in this study what is called the James Bond syndrome. You know James Bond. James was a macho guy. And all the women were in love with James, but he never fell for any of them. You see, he never experienced love because he never experienced passion. You can never experience passion because you think it's better to hold on to power. If you are striving for power in relationships, you will never experience passion because passion requires surrender to the desires of the loved one. And if you're seeking power, all you want is your own desires. When you surrender to another's desires, you risk losing power. A while back, I ran into a girl that I went to high school with, and she was real pretty. She was the junior Miss California our junior year in high school, and she was either the first or second runner-up in the junior Miss USA or Miss America pageant. She was real pretty. And when I ran into her, we started talking, and she said, "You know, how come you never asked me out?" And I went, "Well, She said, "You know, I had kind of a little crush on you. If you'd asked me out, I'd have gone out with you. How come you didn't ask me out?" I said, "Well, apparently I was really stupid." But you see, I was afraid to ask her out because everybody wanted to go out with Carol. And if I asked her out, she was probably going to say no, and I didn't want to look stupid. Guess that didn't work, did it? The good news is I married a different girl from high school, and I think I traded up. And she's not even here this morning to hear that. Yeah, there will be reports. Amen. The price of being in control and avoiding vulnerability is losing out on the possibility of love. You see, because power is the opposite of love. Secondly, power deludes us into making people objects. Power deludes us into making people objects. Paul said, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves." But when we're seeking power, other people become objects that are a means to an end. Men have been deluded by power into wanting to dominate women. You see, it starts young. They did a high school survey of high school students, and they asked them, what is it that makes somebody popular? And this is what they found. Popularity in high school is dependent on how many members of the opposite sex one can attract, but without falling in love with them. I'm going to read that again. Popularity in high school is dependent on how many members of the opposite sex you can attract without falling for them. Whew, sure a good thing we grow up past high school, huh? You see, it depends on the ability to attract the opposite sex without falling. Popularity does. The problem is that people of the opposite sex are not things to be conquered. They're not objects. They are people to love. There's an old saying that says, whom the gods would destroy, they first make drunk with power. Boy, there are deep levels to that we may have never thought of before. And thirdly, power makes us manipulate others for our gain. Each of you should look not only into your own interests, but also to the interests of others. It's too easy for us to just want to get what we want. And we end up manipulating others into doing what we want for the relationship, and it fails to build that relationship. It ends up being a one-sided thing with no passion and with no depth. Well, these are some of the problems of using power in relationships, but how do we overcome these power plays that we find in relationships? I think there are two easy steps. Remember that Max Weber defined power, but he also defined authority. He said authority is the ability to persuade others to do your will without coercion, because those others recognize your leadership as legitimate and your concern as genuine. You see, where power controls, authority leads. Where power rules, authority guides. Where power buys, authority earns. Where power dominates, authority loves. Because power is coercive, but authority is persuasive. Coercion is the crux of why power can't work in relationships. You see, the first step that we need to do to have solid relationships where there aren't power plays is we need to follow the example of Jesus. Look at what Paul in Philippians says about Jesus. He made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. The God who was the creator of the universe, who could do and buy and get and make whatever he wanted, gave that all up and became not just a human being, but the most weak and innocent of human beings, a baby. He grew up as we... God had to go through teething and potty training, for heaven's sakes. Why would he do that? Because of his love for us. It was a giving, loving act. Not just so that we would know that God knows how we feel, but because God wanted us to know how much he loves us. He was willing to give everything up for us. Jesus chose to live the life he lived because he wanted to show his authority. He had the power to do all those things, and yet he chose to give it up. Paul says, Jesus, who being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. We need to follow Jesus' example, and continuing to follow his example, we need to sacrifice. Love always protects. Love always trusts. Love always hopes. Love always perseveres, love never fails. You see, Christ's example of authority is to love with sacrifice. We need to follow Christ's example, and we need to love sacrificially. We need to be willing to give up some of those things that are important to us because they're not important to the one we love. Whether it's a spouse or a friend or a child. And parents, you can't ever force your children to do what you want them to. Even with the most spankings ever. There was a wonderful poem that was written, "Never strike a child in anger, never hit him when irate, save it for some happy time when both are feeling great." We'll talk more about children next week. But spouses, you can't force your mate to love you. Friends, you can't force your friend to love you. You can only sacrifice and follow Christ's example. And because of the authority and giving of your actions, they'll begin to respect you and to look up to you and to desire to be in relationship with you. You see, sacrifice is rewarded with love. There was a man on the subway in New York City who was having an epileptic seizure. And his companion was with him right there, making sure that he didn't bite his tongue and making sure that he didn't hurt himself by bashing his head. And a passerby said, "You know, that's really, really nice that you're doing that for your friend." And with a very serious look on his face, he turned and addressed the individual and said, "Ma'am, the reason this man has epilepsy is because he pulled me out of the way and took the blast from a grenade in Vietnam. The least I can do for him is to make sure he doesn't hurt himself now." Jesus has done so much for us. The least we can do is sacrifice for those we love, let alone for those we don't.